The searchlights had been switched off hours earlier, but the men could still feel them, an itch between their shoulder blades as they crouched in the dark on Mount Davis. The city below was a smear of faint light, its harbor blacked out, ships sitting like shadows on ink. In the gun pits, Canadian gunners from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles of Canada waited beside their weapons, boots slick with sweat inside their socks, despite the December night. Someone checked his watch. Just past dawn by Hong Kong time, but the sky was still a heavy gray lid. When the first Japanese shells came in, they did not whistle. They arrived as sudden, violent punches in the air. One slammed into a battery position, tossing sandbags like toys. Another struck a barracks, blowing out a wall and showering the courtyard with fragments of brick and glass. Men sprinted to their positions, dragging ammunition crates, fumbling at shell fuses with shaking fingers. What they had trained for as rumor, the possibility of war with Japan, was now a fact, and it had started before breakfast. On the other side of the world, Pearl Harbor was still smoking. In Hong Kong, the fight had just begun. The British colony had been considered indefensible by some in London. Surrounded by Chinese territory held by Japan, short on aircraft and with limited artillery, it was a small island garrison facing a modern army. Still, the Empire sent help. 2 Canadian battalions had arrived only weeks earlier after a long sea voyage. Farm boys, miners, clerks, and veterans from Quebec and the prairies. Many had never fired a shot in combat. They were still learning the local terrain when the first shells fell. Across the border in the new territories, the Japanese 38th Division surged forward with speed that stunned the defenders. Outposts that had seemed sturdy on paper turned into death traps once tanks and heavy guns were brought to bear. Indian and British units fought delaying actions along the Gin Drinkers line, trenches and pillboxes carved into the hills, but Japanese infiltrators slipped through ravines and dry riverbeds, flanking strong points and smashing through with grenades and bayonets. Within days, the line unraveled. Orders were given to pull all forces back to Hong Kong Island itself. The retreat was chaotic. Roads choked with vehicles, refugees, and wounded. Canadian companies were assigned rearguard tasks, holding crossroads and hills long enough for others to fall back. At one position, a platoon from the Royal Rifles stayed in their slit trenches until Japanese infantry were nearly on top of them, then slipped away through thick brush, carrying their wounded and leaving behind only a few burned trucks. Rumors spread that the colony would fall within days. The men heard those whispers but kept digging, setting up new positions among the rocky slopes and narrow streets of the island. When Japanese artillery shifted fire to Hong Kong Island, the sound never really stopped. Shells hammered dockyards, reservoirs, and residential districts. Civilians crowded into basements and tunnel shelters as glass rained from shattered windows. For soldiers manning the hills around Wong Nai Chung Gap, every blast kicked dust into their teeth and reminded them how little cover there really was. The gap was the key, the road junction linking the north and south sides of the island. If it fell, the defense would split in two. On the night the Japanese launched their amphibious assault, the Canadians watched the harbor with straining eyes. Then they saw it, dark shapes moving low on the water, powered by quiet engines and paddles. Searchlights flashed on, raking the bay. Machine guns opened up, tearing white paths across the waves. Some landing craft caught fire and spun in circles before sinking. Others kept coming, grounded on the rocky shoreline, and spilled their infantry into the surf. The fighting on the island became close and brutal. In the ravines and along the steep roads, visibility shrank to a few yards. Canadian companies found themselves picking targets by muzzle flashes and shouted orders. At Wong Nai Chung Gap, units from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and local forces were hit from both front and rear as Japanese troops slipped through the jungle-covered slopes. Platoons were cut off, their radio batteries dying, their ammo running low. One Canadian company fought until almost every man was killed or wounded, their bodies later found in a rough semicircle around spent cartridge piles. Survivors from other units fell back, step by bloody step, to secondary lines. Inside Hong Kong City, street fighting flared. Japanese mortar shells crashed into apartment blocks and tram lines. Firefighters worked under shell fire to contain blazes threatening to race through whole districts. Doctors and makeshift aid stations moved from stretcher to stretcher, cutting clothing away, packing wounds, and stepping over broken glass. Messages came in from the front lines. Holding, low on ammunition. Then, later, holding, last clips. For the Canadians, the battle narrowed to simple tasks. Keep the enemy from taking a ridge, cover a road, protect a water reservoir. At Stanley, on the southeastern tip, the Royal Rifles dug in among the rocks and graves of the cemetery, using tombstones as cover. When Japanese troops attacked, grenades bounced among the headstones, and rifle fire cracked between stone markers. One officer gave his men a plain order: hold until you can't. When ammunition ran out, some soldiers used captured rifles, others picked up weapons from the fallen. The phrase, "to the last bullet," stopped being a slogan and became the standard expectation. By late December, the defenders were exhausted. Casualties mounted. The enemy held the high ground overlooking key reservoirs. The civilian population was running out of water, hospitals overflowed. The governor faced a grim calculation: keep fighting and risk a massacre in the city, or surrender and hope that the enemy would honor the rules of war. On December 25th, the white flag went up. It became known as Black Christmas. For the men who had survived the trenches and bunkers, the end of the battle felt less like relief and more like walking into an unknown dark. Captivity began with shock. Japanese soldiers marched prisoners at bayonet point through streets they had defended days before. Civilians watched from broken doorways as columns of gaunt, dirty men shuffled past the Canadians, along with British, Indian, and local troops, were crammed into camps at Sham Shui Po and North Point. Barracks built for far fewer now held hundreds. Food was scarce: thin rice, occasional vegetables, almost no meat. Disease came quickly: dysentery, beriberi, skin infections that turned small cuts into open wounds. Beatings were common. Guards used rifle butts and bamboo sticks to enforce discipline, or simply to vent anger. Men were punished for failing to bow quickly enough, for hoarding crumbs of food, for collapsing on work details. Some prisoners were shipped to labor camps in Japan, crowded into the holds of transport ships that stank of sweat, coal dust, and sickness. At shipyards and mines, they worked long hours with little rest, hauling loads that would have strained healthy men, let alone half-starved prisoners. Letters home, when they were allowed at all, took months to arrive and were heavily censored. Families in Canada waited through long stretches of silence, reading and rereading the last lines they had received before the colony fell. Some wives only learned their husbands were alive when a brief note, scrawled in a shaky hand, finally arrived through Red Cross channels. For many others, no letter ever came. The death rate among the Hong Kong prisoners climbed steadily. Some men simply could not come back from disease and starvation. Their bodies ran out of reserves. Others were killed outright in camp incidents or during forced labor. Those who survived did so through careful sharing of food, quiet acts of defiance, and a determination to get at least one man home to tell the story. They whispered news of the wider war when rumors filtered in, tracing the slow turning of the tide in distant battles. When liberation finally came in 1945, the survivors of Hong Kong were almost unrecognizable, their faces hollowed, their uniforms hanging in rags. They stepped onto Allied ships as thin, stooped men who had left home as young soldiers. Back in Canada, Parades and ceremonies honored them, but the memories of Hong Kong did not fade with the music. Many carried the weight of what they'd seen. Comrades killed in hillside trenches, civilians caught in shell fire, years of hunger and brutality behind barbed wire. The siege of Hong Kong did not change the course of the war the way larger campaigns did. But for the men who fought there, it was everything they had been sent to a colony many in high command believed could not be held, and they held it anyway, right up to the edge of extinction. In bunkers carved into rock, in cemetery trenches, in city streets and prison camps, they fought until they had nothing left to give. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.